speaker and make it clear. Order. Well, I did not make the comments.
Well, it's not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my ever-revolving panel of bloggers and opinion shapers, she is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies and lectures at Massey Uni, blogger Phoebe Fletcher. And she is from New Zealand's biggest feminist blog, The Hand Mirror, commentator and blogger Julie Fairey. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, is Susan Devoy and her views on Waitangi Day an appropriate choice for the new Race Relations Commissioner? Issue 2, has the government quelled the Novo Pay fiasco, or is it too little too late? And issue 3 tonight, the IMF warns of a housing bubble, but is the government listening? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. Susan Devoy was last relevant in the late 1980s, but her views on race relations seem more late 1880s. Bewilderingly, the national government have appointed Dame Susie as our new Race Relations Commissioner, despite her writing a column for the Bay of Plenty Times where she claimed New Zealanders were ashamed of Waitangi Day and that we needed a separate day to celebrate New Zealand like Australia Day. Phoebe, Devoy told Radio New Zealand that she didn't need too many qualifications because the job of Race Relations Commissioner wasn't very complicated. How on earth is a squash player our new Race Relations Commissioner?
Well, I think there are some problems here in that she clearly hasn't even done a Treaty 101 course from reading that Bay of Plenty Times column. Obviously, she has sat on some other boards. She's been on the Halberg Disability Trust Foundation, the Auckland District Health Board, the Auckland Sustainable Council. But I think when you are dealing with that many different groups in society, you need to have some knowledge and sensitivity. It doesn't seem to make sense to me to get somebody who has already had a history of race baiting as the Race Relations Conciliator.
Yeah, but I mean, when you read her column, were you surprised?
I was very surprised that they wouldn't have gone back through her history and looked. I mean, it's clear to me she doesn't really have a level of education, and that Judith Collins claims that because she's a woman she can intimately understand ethnic issues. I don't think that's necessarily the case. As we all know, you know, each of these issues you can have a kind of different ideological perspective on. And I don't think that she's a suitable candidate for that.
Do we need an Australia Day? I mean, in Australia, it seems to have become quite a nationalistic, well, nastiness at times. I mean, you've got sort of white Australians going out and beating up people who aren't white or aren't saluting the flag, or you have all these sorts of stories. Do we need that kind of flag-blinded patriotism in New Zealand?
Well, I think that the issue is that the day itself is not about that. It's about celebrating a partnership that we had between Māori and Pākehā that doesn't get recognised in Australia in the same way. Now, Australia has had more children taken off Aborigines in the stolen generation, and you know the issues around you know, Aboriginal land rights and so on are completely effaced in Australia. So I would be very sorely disappointed to see Waitangi Day replaced by another kind of New Zealand Day. I think that is absolutely not the way forward, and I think it will really stoke up grievances.
Do you think that Susan, the fact that Susan is actually calling for that in her column, makes her completely inappropriate as a choice for the Race Relations Conciliator?
Yes, I would think that you should actually be going back through someone's history before you make that choice. And I think that this kind of smacks of political appointments, and certainly that is going to happen no matter what party is in power, but she is clearly unsuitable for this role.
Julie, this isn't the first questionable appointment to the Human Rights Commission. Hard Right Act acolyte Ken Shirley, the Right Reverend Ravi, and well-known homophobe Brian Neeson were all appointed to the Human Rights Review Tribunal. Can those who abuse human rights protect human rights?
Well, I guess there is an argument about gamekeeper and poachers, and that it takes a hater to recognise and deal with hate, maybe. But
that's a very optimistic view of it.
But personally, I have real concerns about the idea that we're putting into roles which are, you know, Susan Devoy said this is not a conciliator role, it's a commissioner. It's like, but actually conciliation and working with different groups and stuff, that's part of the skill set of being a commissioner.
Yeah.
And that ability to objectively step back from your own personal views, look at the evidence in front of you, work out a pathway forward between groups that will hold very different views and will be quite complex issues at times. I don't see any evidence that that's in her skill set, and it's certainly given her public pronouncements. And let's not forget, this was on February the 5th this year. This is, we're not talking about history, things she said 20 years ago.
Yeah,
we're talking about something she said a couple of months ago, last month.
Yeah.
And with these people, it's the same kind of deal. It's recent history. It's not, you know, I remember years ago, Grant Gillen wrote something sexist in a Fireman's newsletter back in the 70s, and he got hauled over the coals for it when he was an Alliance MP. And, you know, he should be examined on his views, but that just doesn't seem to apply now. And I have some real concerns that she was shoulder tapped for the role as well. She said to Duncan Garner, because he said, you know, were you shoulder tapped or did you apply? And he said, she said, sorry, that she had expressed an interest in the disability side of the Commission's work, not the race side.
Right.
So it does very much sound like this is a politically motivated appointment. It's taken them 9 months to find somebody.
Yeah. For race relations, surely you would hope that someone, whoever took on the role, would have the intellectual capacity for that role. When you read that column that she wrote, did you feel that she was lacking in the intellectual ability?
Well, it's kind of hard to say on television that you think that someone's too stupid for the job. Yeah. So I'm going to stop short of that.
Okay.
But I am concerned that she doesn't have the analytical ability, and in particular that she doesn't have the empathy.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that you really have to be able to. Often when you need to move people on from a sense of grievance, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Now, if she's coming from a space where she's written a column saying, you know, the kinds of things she said, where she's basically ignoring grievance and denying that it exists, that's not a good place to start a conversation.
Phoebe, when can Pākehā celebrate Waitangi Day? Because the main argument Devoy uses is there's too much protest on Waitangi Day and we need a day of celebration. When do you think New Zealanders will be able to celebrate Waitangi Day?
Look, I think this whole argument is just ridiculous, and when David Shearer said the same thing about New Zealand Day, I thought that was also just ridiculous. You know, we need to recognise that there were tangata whenua here when we arrived, that, you know, for them this has potentially not been an easy process. Yeah, it's been a fairly,
you know, they've had a lot of land stolen,
we have
right?
done relatively well, you know, in terms of getting along with each other, but there are always going to be some grievances. And, you know, I think that, you know, it is about time that we get people into these roles that are able to educate people, because we don't have a high level of knowledge on the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand. And one of the roles that the Race Relations Commissioner is supposed to perform is to work with the Human Rights Commission to hold Parliament in check in terms of its legislation on the treaty. It's supposed to be an independent body, and this is, you know, I think a really high concern, these sorts of views being expressed publicly, because they don't encourage people to work together, they encourage division.
But do you think there could be a time in the future where we do actually celebrate Waitangi Day? That we can get together in the same sort of nationalism you see on Australia Day and actually sort of enjoy the fact that we've created this country? When do you think we might be able to get to that point? Do you think that there's still a lot of grievance that needs to be sorted out before we get there?
I think there is grievance that needs to be sorted out. I think there is, at the moment, a kind of balance being struck with the Mondayisation of Waitangi Day. Sorry, for some reason that was a tongue twister. That is occurring at the moment, you know, that pacifies some of those people. I think that we're not as patriotic as Australians anyway, that, you know, New Zealanders don't have this sort of thing of running around with New Zealand flags. You know, what do? We all go out to the beach in isolation and, you know, have a barbecue by ourselves. So I think the idea that we might get, you know, a day where people run around in Australia in bikinis, drinking, you know,
Foster's.
Australian-themed
Yep,
beer with
yep.
Australian-themed hats is probably not a kind of likely outcome.
Fingers crossed. Julie, the Human Rights Commission is about to have 20 to 30% of their workforce slashed. Is National turning our human rights watchdog into a lapdog? Is that what we're seeing here?
It's starting to look that way, isn't it? And I think the other thing that is really important about the Race Relations Commissioner's role in terms of the treaty is not just the relationship with Māori, but acknowledging that all people who come here from overseas are coming on the terms of the treaty. You know, that basically there are tangata whenua and then there are the people of the treaty. And it's not just about Pākehā and Māori, it's a broader concept. And I'm really worried about, you know, cuts will start to lose those nuances and you'll start to lose that institutional knowledge as well, particularly when we're now seeing with the Human Rights Review Tribunal and now this new commissioner, we're seeing a real hollowing out of people who actually have mana in the area, who have expertise and who have that long-term knowledge.
Who will be able to keep Paula Bennett on her toes and not release information about beneficiaries if the Human Rights Commission is looking to almost lose 30% of their staff?
Well, she did do it anyway, and she's
Yes.
never seemed particularly apologetic about it, so
No.
that might not be the best example.
Okay. Finally, will Susan Devoy be our worst race relations commissioner? Your thoughts?
I think quite possibly. I think this is a completely inappropriate appointment.
She has, Colin said she was very forthright and that would make her a good person for the role. I would have preferred to see someone who was very empathetic or very considered in their approach.
Yes.
Very forthright doesn't seem like a good match.
Especially when it's Judith Collins saying that
Yeah,
it's
very,
forthright,
very
right? That's
forthright,
terrifying. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, the government have announced a $6 million fund to compensate schools burnt by the Nova Pay meltdown. But is it too little, too late? Julie, I'm not sure. An extra $11 million, 9 months of a system not working, is a Mr. Fix-It. It seems more to me like a Mr. Expensive Band-Aid trying not to create a blot on his CV. Has Stephen Joyce done enough here to actually pull Nova Pay out?
No, and that's quite clear from the fact that, for example, the $6 million package equates to roughly about 5 hours of staff time per school. There's also no guarantees that it's an ongoing arrangement either, and all of the indicators are that this will be an ongoing problem, potentially over the next 18 months. So if they think the $6 million package is enough, certainly I have a fair bit to do with school land, and there's definitely no one's going, oh, thank goodness this has resolved it. People are bracing themselves for the next problem.
Joyce himself described this as a dog. Why did so many people sign off on this deal? When there was supposed to be all of this oversight, how did it get done?
Yeah, I think there has to be some real questions asked there. I suspect that this is a sign of a minister who's not on top of her portfolio in regard to Hiki Aparata.
Well, the best communicator that National has.
That's right.
That one.
I think we'd all agree that she is excellent and that we understand every word that she says on every occasion. And obviously when she said, yes, let's go ahead with Novo Pay, what she actually meant was, no, this is a dog and we've got a whole lot of things to fix. But obviously our ears are somehow out of tune there, rather than the words that come from her mouth. That seems to be the consistent theme. But the issue with the oversight is significant, but also the issue with the original contract, and both of those need to be looked at. The fact that Banks still has shares, apparently, in Talent 2, you know, this is really starting to smell.
Well, let's get into that. Phoebe, we now know that John Banks was holding shares in Talent 2 while sitting on a committee overseeing the Nova Pay contract. Does this inspire faith in the process?
It absolutely does not inspire faith in the process. And I think that most New Zealanders have lost faith in John Banks a very, very long time ago. I mean, this is like, what?
Anything he touches just smells.
Yes,
Terrible.
you know, like, I did not take a helicopter ride with Kim.com. I do not remember the envelope that Sky City sent me. I do not remember having shares in Nova Pay while I was on an oversight committee. Clearly, you know, there needs to be some kind of look into this. Yeah.
Will we get an inquiry?
maybe on the whole contractual process, I think. But yeah, I agree with Julie. There's, you know, quite huge issues around the contract and the way that this got rolled out so quickly. So the Deloitte report, you know, for example, says that there was also a huge amount of pressure on Novo Pay to release it when they knew they had 147 errors in the system when it went to,
What the bloody hell happened here? Did the Australians just come into town, do a really amazing slick sales pitch, and like a bunch of old people from Whangaproa buying into, I don't know, Sydney property market go, yeah, we're in, sort of thing? Were we just conned?
I have serious doubts actually about IT capacity in New Zealand.
Oh,
and
right.
I kind of wondered this when you could, you know, access people's accounts from WINS kiosks, you know, like how much we actually know about,
people to the shares,
you know, IT and data security.
Right.
And I wonder if maybe this is one of those instances as well.
Surely the entire NovaPay fiasco is a scandal, absolute despicable scandal, yet looking at the Herald Digipoll, National polling higher now than they did at the election. The more teachers suffer, the more popular Keys government becomes. Is the New Zealand electorate a bit sadistic when it comes to teachers?
Well, I imagine there's a lot of teachers feeling that way. But I think actually what the polls are telling us is that there's a lack of an alternative.
Right.
And that's actually why National's numbers are holding up. And you know, they are starting to get quite soft, I think. But it's that viable alternative, and that's one of the problems with NovaPay is what is the viable alternative to just shambling along with this terrible system, because they have dismantled the previous system. So it is a real problem. But the other thing is that teachers have got a whole lot of other issues on the table at the moment. They just are voting at the moment in paid union meetings around the country, thousands of teachers, to consider strike action over their collective agreement negotiations. You're not hearing a whisper about that, but this is actually really big news because everything's focused on NovaPay.
Why are they looking at strike action? What are the issues?
Well, the main issue is actually around a career pathway for primary teachers. Primary principals, secondary principals and secondary teachers all have had an agreement from the government to put a career pathway, a career structure in.
Sure.
But the government's holding out. I have to be a little careful what I say about that because I'm not an official spokesperson on the issue. Sure.
But you've got an insight, and the teachers are not happy with what's going on?
Oh, they're really unhappy.
Has this, you know, not being able to have their money in the account like they're supposed to or like they're expecting, how much stress does that put on teachers?
It's huge. A couple of weeks ago, we had heard that 23 pay clerks had resigned their jobs over NovaPay, which is a huge deal at this point in the economy when there's no jobs to resign your job without necessarily anything else to go to. Also, you know, can you just imagine what it's like to dread payday? You know, especially people who are living from payday to payday, to just sort of be sitting there on Tuesday night thinking, oh, what's happening? Has it gone through? Hasn't it gone through? Where's my pay slip? And you see teachers talking about it on Facebook and people going, mine's arrived, has yours arrived? And, you know, it's just really, really stressful.
I think I'd prefer to have the teachers of the nation looking after my kid than having to worry about whether or not they're getting paid. It seems a little third world to me. You know?
And it's also that, you know, we rely on the professionalism of teachers just to keep going. And, you know, I keep thinking to myself, if this was the police force, it would have been fixed months ago.
Wouldn't it just? Phoebe, has David Shearer's forgetfulness over his UN bank account blunted Labour's ability to attack the government and act over their forgetfulness? I mean, as Julie sort of suggested, the lack of an opposition, that's why National's doing so well. Is Shearer part of that problem?
Well, I think this was a terrible omission, wasn't it? $50,000 sitting in an overseas bank account. Plus, he hasn't actually said how much it was, and he's declared it for the last 3 years with the IRD. Now, when we have, you know, John Banks making so many dodgy deals, it blunts their ability to attack, basically. Shearer not declaring this. So this was a terrible omission. Whatever led to that was absolute political mismanagement and not revealing that details,
right at the front.
You know, even if it was, you know, as he says, forgetting, it's problematic for them because it blunts their ability to attack.
Are we going to see a change of tactic from Chris Hipkins? I mean, he seems to be getting right in there. The hope is, from Labour's point of view, that he's going to be able to get some traction on the government and education. Or is Hekia Parata just too damaged now? It doesn't matter what they throw at him.
I think that there's going to be ongoing issues going on around education. I would agree with Julie that the strikes are going to come up as a major issue. You've got the restructuring of the schools in Christchurch. Teachers are unhappy. This, is going to be an ongoing problem for National.
Final question to both of you. When does any of this start to impact on the popularity of the government? I mean, when are we going to see those poll ratings start to come down?
Well, I think it's interesting that around the country a lot of teachers are trying to get in to see National MPs, and some of them I know are being declined visits. Really? Which is really significant because usually that's, an electorate MP is supposed to be open to those kinds of things. So I think they're starting to get really sensitive about it, National Caucus. Right. And I think that's when people who are in marginal seats start to feel nervous about negative feedback.
When do we start seeing the impact?
Well, I think, this is going to be a problem for them coming into the next election. It is a weak point where Labor can attack quite effectively, I believe.
Fingers crossed. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, the IMF have warned of a housing bubble, but seem to have popped Russell Norman's credibility by denouncing his claims that the high dollar is negatively impacting on manufacturing. Phoebe, if housing is headed for a bubble, which government in their right mind is going to decide to pop it?
Well, I think this, is a very good question. The issues around, what are the ways that we regulate the dollar and so on are actually much more complex than they're being presented. There was an Economist article last year that said the property bubble was 66% in New Zealand. And if you look at, 66% overvalued. If you look at, the former World Bank reports, they have been talking about this for quite some time. Like the 2011 report where they looked at housing, they talked about, quite positively, I thought, without drawing complete conclusions on the way that Iceland had, worked to deleverage. Because the problem was that if you have high household debt and you get a shock to the economy, then that has ongoing effects.
Yeah. Julie, housing affordability will be a main issue going into 2014. Has Labor done its homework on what affordability actually means?
I think that it's going to be really interesting to see as they unveil more detail, and they really must, about their housing package. There's a number of issues that are at play, and the rental market sort of seems to be one that we don't talk about very much, but actually it's a huge player, and there's a lot of people living in rental accommodation that is unaffordable as well. So I'd like to see them do some more work on that particular side of things. And there's a lot of focus on supply, but the fact is that a lot of the new builds are, you see them, like I went to Stonefields the other day, and you see these buildings, and it's just like, who is going to live in these buildings? Because they look quite nice, but are they actually fit to purpose? Big building, tiny little piece of land, 3 or 4 bedrooms, but actually primarily going to be bought by couples or people who maybe only have 1 or 2 children. It's just, there seems to be this expectation of a big house. But is that really what people need? And we need to be having those conversations, I think.
I think that's part of the problem, isn't it? That is so set in the New Zealand ideology that you have this quarter acre,
that's right.
Kind of Leviton, that's where it comes from. Is actually the United States is this, these houses that were built very, very, very cheaply during suburbanisation. That was this kind of quarter acre ideal that you customised yourself. And as Julie is saying, perhaps it is time that we begin thinking around those issues.
But isn't that the difficulty? Because you've got Nick Smith saying we want to open up the sprawl all the way down to southern Hamilton. That's where Auckland's going to start.
Huntly.
Yeah, Warkworth to Huntly. Yeah. That's what he wants. Whereas all the super city is saying, well, let's start urbanising, let's start building up. Who's going to live in the apartments?
Well, we know that there's a real shortage of apartments in the city that are good quality housing in 3 bedrooms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's also a perception that apartment living by a lot of people is of a lower standard, and that's not necessarily the case. I know a lot of people who've had really positive experiences living in apartments, but when it comes to having children, they can't find an apartment that suits their needs.
Who's going to live in the apartments?
Well, I think, there are different ways of living in apartments, as we can see overseas, but this, I think this is something that we need to look into further and discuss and, kind of, I suppose, get over this idea because, that we need a kind of quarter acre, I think, because this is part of what's putting that pressure on that housing bubble, is that we've got, you know, Christchurch not enough places to live and Auckland not enough places to live.
And if we think about creating neighbourhoods that have dare I say, communal aspects to them, like a community garden or a park in the centre, then actually the need to have a quarter acre of your own
is diminished,
is significantly diminished, but people are just really isolated from each other.
Final question to both of you. How does Russell Norman respond to the criticisms the IMF have aimed not directly at him, but at his ideas of more intervention with the Reserve Bank?
Well, I don't think the IMF are known for ever really agreeing with Russell Norman and people who have different approaches on monetary policy to the orthodox. So I don't know that he needs to be too worried about that.
So
I don't think
IMFs have to school themselves up a little?
Well, not necessarily, but I think, you know, if we look at some of the things that the IMF and the World Bank have foisted on other countries overseas, have been heavily unpopular.
Russell's not going to lose any sleep?
Well, I think too that there's a diversity of positions within the World Bank, and if you read through, if you read back through those IMF reports, like they're certainly not saying the same thing all the time. This is one particular spokesperson.
Let's wrap the show with the final word. Julie, your final word this week is?
My final word is basically I want to encourage people to consider running for local government. The election's coming up at the end of the year. Tickets are selecting now. Basically, if you're a lefty, if you've got progressive values, particularly if you're a woman and you get things like community development, I think it'd be great to see people running.
Oh, that's fantastic. Great idea. Thank you. And your final word this week?
Mine would be that the 2013 World Threat Assessment got released by the United States government, by the US top advisor, actually climate change. And this is something that the Chief Commander of the US Navy in the Pacific has said that climate change is the biggest threat to the Pacific region.
Wow.
So I just wanted to reiterate, I mean, this has been something that's been talked about in American defence policy for quite some time, but there again, this week we have the notion that climate change is actually quite a threat, and they are talking about the Pacific, of course, because we have countries that are going underwater. They say this is going to cause increased migration, that's going to have effects on defence policy. So just throwing that into the mix.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. Our new Race Relations Commissioner says that we need to dump Waitangi Day and get ourselves an Australian Day styled celebration. Folks, we need an Australian Day as badly as we need a squash player to be Race Relations Commissioner. Don't white Australians beat up anyone not white on Australia Day? Didn't they almost complete a cultural and actual genocide on their Indigenous populations? How is Susan bloody Devoy the Race Relations Commissioner? How? Susan Devoy as Race Relations Commissioner is about as appropriate as Paul Henry chairing the Broadcasting Standards Authority or making Cameron Slater the Surgeon General. The ignorance she espouses in her Waitangi Day column alone should prevent her from being let anywhere near the Human Rights Commission. To want to ignore the grievances of the past so Dame Susie can start gins at 4 p.m. under the guise of some little brother nationalism is beneath the role of Race Relations Commissioner. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.